The courtroom smelled like old wood and nervous sweat. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow on rows of stiff-backed chairs filled with people who barely moved. Everyone was waiting. Lawyers shuffling papers, a bailiff standing near the door with his hands clasped, and in the front row of the gallery, a 12-year-old girl sitting perfectly still beside her foster mom. She wore a clean but slightly too big sweater and kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the woman standing at the podium below. That woman was her birth mother. She looked tired but also determined. Her voice trembled just a little as she spoke to the judge, pleading for another chance. She'd been through rehab, held down a job for over a year, and attended every single visitation without fail. Now she was asking the court to let her daughter come home. At the bench sat the judge, a man in his late 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and a reputation for fairness. He rarely showed emotion. Lawyers said he could shut down an outburst with a single look. He listened quietly, chin resting on his knuckles, eyes narrowed just enough to show he was paying attention but not swayed. The hearing had been going on for nearly 2 hours. It was one of those cases that tugged at people's hearts but also made them uneasy. Everyone knew the system wasn't perfect. Kids bounced between homes. Parents made mistakes, some forgivable, some not. And judges had to decide based on law and evidence, not feelings, but feelings were everywhere in that room. The girl hadn't said a word since she arrived. She'd been through this before. Multiple hearings, caseworkers, interviews, court-appointed therapists. She knew the drill. Speak only when spoken to. Don't cry. Don't get angry. Just be quiet and cooperative. That's what they always said. But something was different today. As the mother finished her statement and stepped back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, the judge leaned forward slightly. "Thank you," he said in his calm, measured tone. "Counsel for the state, your rebuttal?" Before the lawyer could stand, a small voice cut through the silence. Wait, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it stopped everyone cold. All eyes turned toward the back of the gallery. The girl was on her feet. Her foster mom reached for her arm, whispering, "Honey, sit down, you can't just..." But the girl gently pulled away. She didn't run or rush. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her sneakers barely making a sound on the worn carpet. The bailiff took a half step forward, hand hovering near his belt, but then paused. There was something in the way she carried herself. Not defiant, not scared, just resolved. She stopped a few feet from the bench and looked up. The judge frowned slightly. "Young lady, you'll need to return to your seat." "Court is still in session." She didn't move. She just stared at him, her eyes wide and steady. And then, in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, but soft, almost gentle, she said 4 words. "You're my real father." The room didn't just go quiet. It went hollow, like all the air had been sucked out. The judge froze. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the bench. His face, usually unreadable, drained of color so fast it looked like someone had flipped a switch. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to wake from a dream. Behind him, the court reporter stopped typing mid-sentence. The lawyer for the state dropped his notes. The mother in the front row gasped and covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling over. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. No one moved. No one breathed. The girl didn't flinch. She just stood there, waiting. Not demanding, not accusing, just stating a fact she'd carried inside her for years. Finally, the judge found his voice. It came out rough, shaky, nothing like the firm tone he used to command a courtroom. "Recess," he said, his voice cracking on the word. "Court is recessed. Indefinitely." He didn't look at anyone as he stood and hurried through the side door behind the bench, nearly stumbling on the step. The bailiff finally moved, gently guiding the girl back to her seat, though his usual stern expression had softened into something closer to awe. Outside the courtroom, whispers erupted. Reporters who'd been covering the custody case, already a local story due to the mother's long battle, immediately pulled out phones. Within minutes the news was spreading, but inside the girl sat back down, her hands folded again. Her foster mom squeezed her shoulder, eyes wet with tears she hadn't expected. "You okay?" she whispered. The girl nodded. "I just wanted him to know," she said simply. She hadn't planned to say it in court. Not really. She'd thought about writing a letter, or waiting until she was older. But as she watched her mother beg for a second chance, something clicked. If her mom could face her past and fight for what she loved, then maybe she could too. And those 4 words, they weren't meant to hurt. They weren't a weapon. They were a truth she'd held on to like a secret lifeline, a truth that tied her to a man who'd never known she existed. Now he knew. Back in his chambers, the judge sat at his desk, head in his hands. His heart pounded like it hadn't in decades. Memories he'd buried long ago came rushing back. The late nights in law school. The woman with the bright laugh and tired eyes. The breakup that felt like survival at the time. He'd told himself he was doing the right thing by walking away. Building a career. Becoming someone who mattered. He never imagined that someone would walk into his courtroom one day and undo it all with 4 quiet words. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with confusion and speculation. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was the girl in the too big sweater who'd just changed everything. Not with anger or drama, but with honesty. And for the first time in his life, the man who'd spent years judging others didn't know how to judge himself. 15 years earlier, the man who now sat stunned behind the bench was just a law student with big dreams and bigger doubts. He worked nights at a diner to pay rent, carried around dog-eared case books like they were sacred texts, and believed, deep down, that if he worked hard enough, he could outrun his past. He came from a family that barely scraped by, and law school felt like his one shot at something better, not just for himself, but for whoever might come after him. Back then, he met her at a campus coffee shop. She was studying art, sketching in a worn notebook while sipping black tea. They talked for hours that first night about justice, about beauty, about how the world could be kinder if people just tried. She had a way of seeing things others missed. He admired that, loved it even. Their relationship was brief but intense. It burned bright in the space between finals and part-time shifts, between dreams and deadlines. But when graduation neared, reality set in. A prestigious clerkship awaited him in another state. She wasn't ready to leave her studio, her city, her fragile sense of self. They argued. They cried. And one rainy afternoon, they said goodbye. He never knew she was pregnant. She found out a month later. Alone, scared. Her own family had long since given up on her. Too emotional, too unstable, they said. She tried to tell him once. Sent a letter, but it came back unopened. Maybe he'd already moved. Maybe he just didn't want to know. She kept the baby. At first she tried. She got a job at a print shop, rented a tiny apartment, painted murals on weekends to make extra cash. But old habits crept back in. Late nights, bad choices, the kind of coping that only makes things worse. By the time the baby was 2, child services had stepped in. The little girl went into foster care for the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Over the years, the mother cycled in and out of the system, sometimes clean, sometimes not. Each time she got her daughter back, hope flickered, but the weight of her past always pulled her under again. The girl learned early not to get too attached, to homes, to adults, even to her own name, which changed depending on who was filling out the paperwork. But one thing stayed constant, a faded photo tucked in the back of her school notebook. A man in a graduation robe, smiling beside a woman with wild hair and paint on her hands. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "Your dad. He's smart. He'll be someone." She didn't know his name, didn't know where he was. But she held on to that photo like a promise. As she grew older, she started asking questions. Her foster parents were kind but honest. "We don't know much," they'd say. "Your mom never talked about him much. Said he chose his career over her." That stung, but it also sparked something in her. A quiet determination. If he was out there, she wanted to find him. Not to blame him, just to see if he looked like her. If he had the same crooked smile, the same way of tilting his head when he listened. Last year, her school started a family history project. Everyone had to build a tree, interview relatives, share stories. Most kids groaned. She stayed up all night. Her social worker, noticing her distress, gently suggested a DNA test through a nonprofit that helped foster kids connect with biological relatives. It wasn't guaranteed to work, but it was a start. Weeks later, the results came back. Distant cousins. A few matches. And one strong, undeniable link. A man listed as close family, likely parent. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed his name into a search engine. Up popped a photo. Same eyes, same jawline. Same serious expression, and beneath it, honorable last name, presiding judge, county courthouse. Her breath caught. She printed the photo, compared it to the old one. It was him. She didn't tell anyone at first. Not her foster mom, not her therapist. She just watched. Read news articles about rulings he'd made, listened to recordings of court sessions when they were public. She wanted to understand who he was, not just as a father, but as a person. And then she learned about the custody hearing. Her mom was fighting to get her back, really fighting this time. Clean for over a year, working full-time, attending parenting classes. The girl believed her. She wanted to go home. But she also knew the judge assigned to the case was him. She didn't plan to speak in court. She told herself she'd just watch, see how he acted, see if he seemed kind, fair, human. But when her mom stood there, voice breaking as she begged for another chance, something shifted inside the girl. She thought about all the times adults had made decisions about her life without ever asking what she wanted. This time she wouldn't stay silent. So she stood up and said the 4 words that had lived in her chest for years. Now, back in the present, the fallout was just beginning. News vans gathered outside the courthouse by noon. Reporters called the clerk's office, the mayor's office, even the foster agency. No one would confirm anything, but rumors spread faster than facts. Judge's secret daughter speaks in court, one headline read. Another, custody case turns into family drama. The girl's foster mom kept the blinds closed and turned off the phone. We're not talking to anyone, she told the girl firmly, but with a hug. This is your story. You get to decide who hears it. Meanwhile, the judge hadn't left his chambers all afternoon. He sat at his desk staring at an old photo, one he hadn't looked at in over a decade. Her, smiling in that coffee shop, sunlight catching the gold in her hair. He remembered how she'd laugh at his terrible jokes, how she'd sketch him while he studied. He'd loved her, but he'd been afraid. Afraid of failing, of being tied down, of becoming like the men in his own family who never got a fair shot. So he chose the safe path. The lonely path. Now a child, his child, was sitting just down the hall waiting for a system that had failed her too many times to finally do right by her. He picked up the phone, called his assistant. Cancel my schedule for the rest of the week, he said, voice low. And find out everything you can about that girl. Her school, her caseworker, her medical records, everything. But quietly and ethically, he wasn't sure what he'd do with the information. But for the first time, he didn't want to run. He wanted to understand. That night, alone in his quiet apartment, he opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a box of letters he'd never sent, drafts he'd written during law school, full of apologies, hopes, questions. He'd thrown them away, then dug them back out. Couldn't let go completely. Now he took out a fresh sheet of paper. He didn't write, "Dear daughter." Too formal. Too heavy. Instead, he started with, "I don't know what to say. But I'm listening." He didn't send it, not yet. But just writing it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in a long time. And somewhere across town, a 12-year-old girl lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if the man in the robe had looked at her long enough to see himself in her eyes. She hoped he had. Because if he did, maybe, just maybe, he'd choose her this time. The story didn't stay inside the courthouse for long. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Local news stations ran clips of the courtroom doors opening and closing. Reporters speculating about a shocking family revelation during a routine custody hearing. Online, strangers debated whether the judge had done something wrong, whether the girl was telling the truth, whether the system had failed yet another child. Some called it a betrayal of justice. Others called it the most human moment they'd seen in a courtroom in years. But in the middle of all that noise were real people trying to live real lives. The girl stayed home from school. Her foster mom kept the curtains drawn and the phone unplugged. Reporters had already shown up at the front door twice, holding microphones like they were offering peace instead of intrusion. "We just want to hear her side," one had said. But the girl didn't want to be a side. She just wanted to be a kid. She spent the day drawing, something she'd always done when the world felt too loud. On a fresh sheet of paper, she sketched the courtroom from memory. The high ceiling, the wooden bench, the judge's face, the exact moment she spoke. She didn't make him look angry or cold. She drew him the way she saw him, stunned, yes, but also sad. like he'd just remembered something he'd spent years trying to forget. Her birth mother called that afternoon. Voice shaking, she said, "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't even know he was your father until you said it." She'd been just as shocked as everyone else. All those years ago, she'd told herself it was better if he never knew. She didn't want him tied to her mess, but now looking back, she wondered if she'd been protecting him more than her daughter. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you everything." The girl didn't blame her. She understood. In a way only someone who's lived through broken promises can, that people do the best they can with what they have, even when it's not enough. Meanwhile, the judge faced a different kind of storm. Judicial ethics boards don't move fast, but they move quietly. By midweek, a formal inquiry had begun, not because he'd done anything illegal, but because the appearance of bias in a custody case involving his own child raised serious concerns. He'd already recused himself, but that didn't stop the whispers. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly in the hallway now gave tight nods and hurried past. One longtime friend left a voicemail. "Man, I don't know what to say, just be careful." He spent hours reviewing court transcripts, not of the hearing, but of every case he'd ever handled involving children. Had he been too harsh? Too detached? Had he ever stopped to think that behind every file was a real child, scared, confused, hoping someone would see them? He hadn't. Not really. Now he couldn't stop seeing her face. He called the head of the county's child services division, not as a judge, but as a private citizen. He asked questions no one expected. How many kids age out of foster care with no family to turn to? How many go years without a single visit from a biological parent? What happens to them after 18? The answers haunted him. At night, he walked through his apartment, spacious, tidy, silent, and realized how empty it felt. He had awards on the wall, degrees in frames, a view of the city skyline, but no photos of people. No laughter echoing in the halls. No one to ask how his day was. He'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but it had no heart. Back at the foster home, the girl tried to return to normal. She went back to school on Friday, hoodie pulled up, head down. Kids whispered. Teachers gave her careful, pitying looks. But one person didn't treat her differently, her art teacher. Without saying a word, she handed the girl a fresh sketchbook and a set of charcoal pencils. "Draw what you need to," she said simply. That small act of kindness meant more than any headline. Over the weekend, the judge made a decision. He wouldn't fight the ethics inquiry. He wouldn't give interviews, but he would act. He contacted a nonprofit that supported foster youth, quietly through a third party, and pledged a significant donation. Not for publicity, just to help. Then he reached out to a retired judge known for mentoring at-risk teens. "I'd like to get involved," he said. "Not as a judge, just as someone who wants to listen." He still hadn't spoken to the girl directly. He knew it wasn't his place to force a relationship. But he also knew he couldn't pretend this never happened. One afternoon, he sat down and wrote a letter. Not to the press, not to his colleagues, but to her. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't make excuses. He simply said, "I didn't know you existed. But now that I do, I want to know you if you're willing." No pressure, no expectations, just, "I'm here." He gave it to her foster mom through a neutral social worker. With instructions, only give it to the girl if she asks. She did. 2 days later, she read it at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window. She didn't cry, but she folded the letter carefully and put it in the same box as the old photo. That night, she wrote back, just 3 sentences. "I don't need you to fix everything. I just needed you to know I'm real, and I'm not going away." When the judge read those words, he finally let himself cry quietly in his office, long after everyone else had gone home. Outside, the world kept spinning. The news cycle moved on to the next scandal. But inside, something had shifted. Not because of drama or outrage, but because 2 people, separated by years and silence, had chosen honesty over fear, and sometimes that's enough to begin again. The meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon in a small conference room at the County Family Services building. Neutral ground, supervised, quiet. No cameras, no reporters, just 2 chairs, a table, and a social worker sitting near the door, there only if needed. The girl arrived first, wearing the same sweater she'd worn in court, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She didn't fidget. She just sat and waited, eyes on the door. When he walked in, he looked different. Not in his robe, not behind a bench. Just a man in a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, hands slightly trembling. He paused in the doorway as if unsure whether he was allowed to enter. She nodded once. That was enough. He sat across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full of everything they hadn't said for 12 years. Then he did something no one in that courthouse had ever seen him do. He apologized, not with legal language, not with polished words meant to smooth things over, just raw, simple truth. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "I didn't know about you. But even if I had, I might not have been ready. And that's on me." She looked at him, not with anger, not with hope, just with quiet observation. "Did you ever look for me?" she asked. The question hit him like a punch to the chest. He swallowed hard. "No," he admitted. "I didn't. I thought your mom didn't want me involved, and I was scared. Scared I'd mess up. Scared I wasn't the kind of man who could be a father." She nodded slowly. She'd expected that answer. Not because she wanted to hear it, but because it felt honest. "I used to imagine you," she said after a while. "Not like a superhero or anything. Just someone who'd show up. Even if it was just once." He looked down at his hands. "I wish I had." They talked for nearly an hour about small things at first. Her favorite subject in school, art, what she wanted to be when she grew up, maybe a teacher, or someone who helps kids like me, what kind of music she liked. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions gently, didn't try to impress her, didn't promise things he couldn't keep. At one point, she pulled out her sketchbook and showed him the drawing of the courtroom. He stared at it for a long time. "You made me look kind," he said, surprised. "You were kind," she replied. "In that moment. You looked like you finally saw me." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just said thank you. Back home, the girl's birth mother wrestled with her own feelings. She was glad her daughter had spoken her truth. But part of her worried, what if he tried to take her away? Not out of malice, but out of guilt? Out of a sudden need to do the right thing? She'd worked so hard to get clean, to prove she could be trusted, she couldn't lose her again. But when she talked to her daughter that night, the girl surprised her. "He's not trying to replace you," she said. "He's just trying to be in my life. That doesn't mean I stop being yours." Those words brought tears to her eyes. For the first time, she felt like her daughter truly understood her, not as a failure, but as someone who'd fought her way back. Meanwhile, the custody case moved forward with a new judge, a woman known for her patience and deep understanding of trauma-informed care. The original judge formally recused himself from all related matters, and the court accepted it without question. The new hearing was scheduled for the following month, but this time, the focus wasn't just on the mother's past, it was on the girl's wishes, her stability, and what would truly serve her best interests. Public attention had started to fade. The news had found a new story. But online, the case sparked quiet conversations. Foster care advocates shared it as an example of how children are often silenced in systems that claim to protect them. Legal ethics professors used it in classrooms to discuss impartiality, bias, and the human cost of emotional detachment. And in living rooms across the country, parents held their kids a little tighter, reminded that time doesn't wait, and neither do children. The judge, for his part, began showing up in places no one expected. He volunteered at a youth center on weekends, not as a judge, but as Mr. J, helping teens with homework or just listening when they needed to talk. He didn't mention his title, didn't bring it up unless asked. Most kids didn't even know who he was, and that was how he liked it. One afternoon, a teenager asked him, "Why'd you start coming here?" He thought for a moment. "Because I missed something important a long time ago," he said, "and I don't want anyone else to feel like they don't matter." Back at the Family Services office, the social worker who'd overseen the meeting wrote a brief note in her file. Child and biological father engaged in open, respectful dialogue. No signs of coercion or distress. Child expressed clarity about her needs and boundaries. Progress observed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't headline-worthy, but it was real. A few days later, the girl received a small package in the mail. No return address, just her name. Inside was a set of high-quality colored pencils and a blank sketchbook, thicker paper, the kind artists use. Tucked in the front cover was a note. "For your next drawing, Whatever it is, I'd be honored to see it. She smiled. Not because it was expensive, but because he remembered. That night, she started a new sketch. Not of a courtroom this time, but of a park bench, two people sitting side by side, one tall, one small, looking at the same sunset. No words, just presence. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself imagine a future where she didn't have to choose between the people who loved her. She could just be loved. The system would keep turning. Cases would come and go. But in that quiet space between a father's regret and a daughter's courage, something rare had taken root, not justice in the legal sense, but the kind that heals. And sometimes that's the only kind that really matters. The final custody hearing was nothing like the first. No cameras outside, no hushed whispers in the hallway. Just a quiet courtroom on a rainy Thursday morning, the kind of day that makes everything feel softer, slower. The new judge, a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice, sat patiently as the lawyers presented their closing thoughts. But this time, the most important voice wasn't theirs. Before any ruling was made, the judge turned to the girl. "Would you like to say anything?" she asked gently. The girl stood. She didn't walk to the bench this time. She just spoke from her seat, clear and steady. "I love my mom," she said. "She's worked really hard, and I want to live with her part of the time." She paused, then added, "But I also want to keep seeing my foster family. They've been my home when I needed one." She looked down for a second, then back up. "And I'd like to get to know my dad too, on my terms. When I'm ready." No one interrupted. No one argued. It was as if the room understood. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about belonging. The judge nodded. A week later, the decision came. Shared custody. The girl would live primarily with her birth mother, with regular visits to her foster family. Supervised time with her father would begin slowly. Coffee dates, walks in the park, no pressure. Everything would be guided by what the girl needed, not what adults assumed was best. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would still be hard days, mornings when old fears crept back in, moments of doubt, times when the weight of everything felt too heavy for a 12-year-old to carry. But for the first time, she had choices, and people who were willing to listen. Her mother moved into a small apartment near the girls' school. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, warm, and full of second chances. She kept going to her support meetings, kept her job, and every night without fail she asked her daughter one question: "How are you really doing?" The foster mom stayed close too. She came to school events, helped with homework over video calls, and never made the girl feel guilty for wanting to be with her birth mother. "Family isn't just blood," she'd say. "It's who shows up." As for the man who'd once sat behind the bench in silence, his life had changed in ways he never expected. He didn't quit being a judge, but he stepped back from high-profile cases. Instead, he took on more juvenile and family court assignments, the ones others avoided because they were messy, emotional, and rarely had clear answers. He started listening differently, not just to the facts, but to the fear in a child's voice, the exhaustion in a parent's eyes, the quiet hope beneath every plea. He also kept his promise. Every other Saturday, he met the girl at a park near her school. At first, they just sat on a bench and talked about nothing important. What she'd drawn that week, a funny thing her teacher said, the stray cat she'd been feeding behind the library. He never pushed, never tried to fill 12 years in one afternoon. He just showed up. One Saturday, she brought her sketchbook. "Draw with me?" she asked. He laughed softly. "I haven't drawn anything since middle school." "Doesn't matter," she said, handing him a pencil. "Just try," so he did. His lines were shaky, his shapes uneven, but she didn't laugh. She just watched, then said, "You're better than you think." That small moment, two people drawing badly under a cloudy sky, meant more to him than any verdict he'd ever delivered. Months passed. Seasons changed. The story that had once lit up headlines became just another quiet chapter in real lives. But its ripple effects lingered. The local foster care agency started a new program, Voice First, where kids over 10 could share their wishes directly with the court in a safe, supported setting. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The judge quietly funded part of it, never taking credit. At a community event that fall, he was asked to say a few words. He stood at the mic, not in a robe, just a man in a sweater, and said something simple. Justice isn't just about rules. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and giving them the space to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing in a courtroom isn't a ruling. It's a single sentence spoken from the heart. Afterward, a young girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, walked up to him. She held a piece of paper. "I drew this for you," she said shyly. It was a picture of a courtroom. But instead of a stern judge, the bench held a man with kind eyes, and in the gallery, a girl standing tall speaking. He thanked her. Then he pinned it to the wall of his office, right next to his law degree. Back at home, the girl who started it all was getting ready for bed. She placed her latest sketch on her nightstand, a drawing of 3 houses connected by a winding path. One labeled Mom, one foster home, and one simply Dad. Not perfect. Not the same. But all part of her story. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew this. She wasn't invisible anymore, and sometimes that's enough to build a life on. Years later, when people asked how it all turned out, no one gave a dramatic answer. There were no grand reunions or tearful speeches. Just ordinary days filled with small acts of care. A phone call, a shared meal, a walk in the rain. The kind of love that doesn't shout but stays. Because real healing doesn't happen in headlines. It happens in quiet rooms, in patient silences, in the space between "I'm sorry" and "I'm here," and in the end, those 4 words that once turned a judge pale had done something far more powerful than shock or scandal. They'd built a bridge, not all at once, not without stumbles, but step by step, heart to heart, they led 2 lost people back to each other, not as judge and child, not as strangers bound by DNA, but as 2 humans learning, slowly, how to belong.